I am so grateful and excited to be able to share what we've learned with all of you. Really excited. So as we get started, I have a question for you. Who here keeps a diary? Anyone? And who has kept a diary in the past? Has anyone ever had somebody read their diary? That's where I'm like, yes. Painful, like a painful story for another day. My husband, Ben, used to keep journals when he was in college, and at the time, his nickname was the Whaler, which is also a story for another time. And so he called his journals the Whalerdential Library. And this scrappy box of cardboard, every once in a while, he'll bring it down and read through his journals from when he was a younger man. And he's always surprised by something he finds in there, right? Something that his memory had changed. And that's what's so amazing about diaries. They're not scripted, they're not rehearsed, they're written in the moment. And then when you read it later, it turns out that what you experienced is more complicated than you remember. And in a very simplistic way, that's what we were trying to do with the US Financial Diaries Project. We collect a tremendous amount of data in the US about financial lives. Much of it we share at this conference, much of it you all are familiar with. We collect things like the average size of debit transactions compared to credit transactions. We collect new housing starts. We collect unemployment rates. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? But for the most part, that data is collected in aggregate, or it's collected as averages, or it's collected as a snapshot in time. And often, the averages can be misleading, right? So if you think about the weather, if you go to Duluth, like the average temperature, 35 degrees, but on a given day, you're not that likely to visit there and have it be 35 degrees, right? It's going to be 15 in the winter, it's going to be 70 in the summer. And so those averages really don't tell you everything you need to know. So with the diaries, we had this extraordinary chance to try and go underneath the averages. I know you all just turned the lights down, but I really wanted to acknowledge somebody. I don't know if Nancy Castillo is in the room. But Nancy deserves a round of applause. She's back there. She's way back. I love them. She's waving as she should. So Nancy helped to lead this work for the first several years of it, and is still a part of the day-to-day team. And what we were able to do with Nancy's help and with Jonathan Mordock at New York University and a whole team of researchers and field researchers is to work really intensively with 235 families. And so what we did is we hired 10 field researchers and situated them in 4 different locations in the US. In Mississippi, New York, along the Ohio-Kentucky border, and in California. And each of the field researchers worked with 20 to 30 families and visited them regularly over the course of a year. And the idea was to try and gather a full year's worth of information about their financial lives. Every single dollar that they spent, earned, saved, borrowed, gave away. I mean, if you bought a couch, we wanted to know. If you borrowed a couch, we wanted to know. Right? If your mom babysat for your kids so you could go to work, we wanted to know. And the families were really diverse, right? We knew that we couldn't go that deep with a nationally representative sample. But we could get a representative picture of what it was like to be in America. And so we had families of every ethnicity. We had families who were recent immigrants. We had families who had been in this country for generations. The common thread was that every household had at least one person in the household who was working. And so the idea was to understand, I think as Bob said, people who were working but still struggling. People who had, and so about a quarter of the sample was near the middle income, about a quarter was near the poverty line, and then a half was in between, the remaining half. And we really, it was a hard process, even for the families, right? We spent a lot of time with them, and it was a massive, massive investment by them as well as by our research team. And it was also a massive investment for the set of partners who all participated in this work. So Bob mentioned the Citi Foundation and the Ford Foundation. The Omidyar Network was also part of the team. And they, along with CFSI and NYU, invested years in this work. And the reason that we did that was really to try and get underneath those averages. And I'm so grateful and appreciative that we had that partnership. It was invaluable. But the diaries aren't about us, right? Aren't about us as partners. They're about the families. And so what I'm mostly going to do is talk about them. And I've been doing a lot of this talk, right? I've been anywhere anybody invites me to talk about the financial diaries. And I have a pretty standard book talk at this point. And usually what I do is I go very deep on one or two families. And I put up some charts about their financial life. And then I put up some other charts about how their financial life is represented in the whole diary sample. And then I put up more charts about how what we saw in the diaries is validated by national data. And I intersperse it with pictures so that it's more interesting, right? So it's not boring, I promise. But I didn't really want to do that here. And I didn't want to do that here because this is a group of people who knows this material deeply and who comes at it in a different way, right? All of you are either working with customers who are similar to the families that we worked with in the diaries, or you're innovating new products and services, right? You're starting from a different place. And so what I wanted to do really was to talk about some moments that stuck with me particularly through this work. And it's a little like diaries, like who knows why your brain picks certain moments to remember and other moments to forget. I think that these are the moments that stick with me because these are moments when something touched me, when my brain opened in different ways and my heart opened in different ways. Like these are moments when my empathy expanded. And so, altogether, they don't tell the full picture of everything you could read in the diaries book or everything you could read in other consumer research, but they're moments when my understanding really broadened. And so I wanted to share those with you. So the first person I'm going to talk about, I met as we were setting up the study, a woman that I'm calling Carol Shelton. And of course, we changed lots of details about people's lives to protect their anonymity. And so we met Carol before we had started collecting any data. And we found the households that we worked with through community-based organizations. So she and I met in a row house that had been converted into an office space. So it felt like we were sitting in somebody's kitchen because we were sitting in what had been somebody's kitchen and talking about her life. And we hadn't yet set up the full research protocol, so we were asking really open-ended questions to inform that. And I said, so tell me about your financial life, big picture. And I'm paraphrasing, but she basically said, it's all about Sunday nights. So she said, on Sunday nights, my husband and I each get our hours. She worked as a checker at a grocery store, and her husband also had an hourly job working in a warehouse. So she said, on Sunday nights, we get our schedules. And sometimes I get 30 hours, sometimes I get 38. Same with my husband. Sometimes he gets 42, sometimes he gets 25. So we do the math. We add up how many hours we're each working. We estimate what we think our paychecks are going to be. And then we do the same thing with our bills. And we figure out which bills we can pay and which bills we can't pay. And it stuck with me, right? My Sunday night's so different than that. Yeah, sure, me and Ben, we talk about money, but if we talk about money, we tend to talk about, have we saved enough for our retirement? When will we retire? What will it look like? Where will we travel? Are we saving enough for our kids' education? Right? And so all of a sudden, my expectation about what budgeting looks like, what thinking about money looks like, what leisure time on Sunday night to prepare for the week looks like. Another person who really stuck with me, I'll name Mueed Sohar, and he's somebody we met much later in the process, after we had gathered data and we were trying to make sense of it. And he's in Queens, and so Jonathan and I could just hop on the subway. We have done this work in Manhattan and sit in his living room. And he's a Bangladeshi immigrant. I know a lot of Bangladeshi immigrants in theory, because in Manhattan, all the taxis and all the delis and all sorts of other businesses are populated by people with whom I rarely talk about more than the weather, right? And again, we had this open-ended conversation. But with Mueed, there was something specific he was doing we didn't understand. He had a pretty big credit card balance and a pretty big savings balance. And we said, why, right? He said, the look on his face was, I know, that is so dumb, right? He said, I know. He said, I was trained as an accountant back home. That's what I used to do for work. I know this makes no sense. I send all of my excess money home to my family. I don't have any family in this country. I'm alone here. We don't usually think of loneliness when we think of credit cards. But for him, those were so connected. Right? In that same period of time, we went and met with this amazing woman named Melinda Perez in Brooklyn. And we met in this Colombian bakery, and it was hot, like not quite like Austin, but bad. And we were delighted to be in the air conditioning. We got there before she did. We were waiting for her. She comes rushing in, like a bundle of energy, like this very small woman, but she expanded, like she just filled the whole place anyway, right? And she was carrying a really suitcase, wearing a backpack. And we spent an hour with her basically glowing and bragging about her financial life, the way you do when you're talking to somebody who you know is on your side. And what she was glowing about and bragging about was how hard she worked. She had 4 jobs, and she was ecstatic to tell us about that. She worked at a bakery, she cleaned houses, she was a babysitter, and she unzips this suitcase, right? She sells clothes. So this suitcase was full of very carefully packed in plastic t-shirts, right? Every color, turquoise, orange, green, that she was selling in between jobs as she went from one job to another job. And she said, the great thing about this country, I can work as much as I want. It was amazing to me. I'm pretty busy. Like, I feel full up. I got one job. Like, I'm good, right? It's hard. Another person who really made an impression on me, we named Maria Rodriguez in the study. And when you picture her, you should picture one of those communities in California where all the houses were built at the same time, and they're all basically the same footprint, row after row of cute, lovely, small, West Coast houses. And she had totally personalized hers, like everything about their lawn screamed the personality of their family. And by the time I went to see her, I thought I knew her pretty well, because we had always wanted to share our findings early to let people know what we were learning, and we had written a very early household profile about her and her family. And so, and in that profile, we thought we saw a lot of red flags, lots of things that we thought were kind of going wrong in her financial life. She had a big home equity line of credit. We didn't understand why she was paying that down instead of her mortgage. She lived there with her husband, her mother-in-law, and her 2 grown sons. It seemed to us that they needed all 5 of their sources of income, but she was talking about breaking up the household. And when I went to see her, I knew that she had been very angry when she read that analysis. And she had told our field researcher that she didn't think it was accurate, and we had made some revisions. But I didn't know why she was so mad. And when I sat with her, I got it. Because she walked me through the waterfall of decisions she had planned, right? If my son moves out and it turned out we need his income, then I'm going to do this. If we can't pay down the home equity line of credit, but my mortgage is gone, I'm going to do that, right? She had a whole vision for what she was going to do. And all of the things that we had thought of as red flags, she thought of as possibilities. So it's easy when you think about averages and you think about business strategies to forget to think about people. And the people that we got to know are being batted around by some big trends that are really outside of their control and that are really dramatically changing their everyday financial experience. So I think about 3, and we wrote about 3 in the Diaries book. The first is the idea of how work has been changing. And we talk about it as a great risk shift, right? So what's happened is that the labor market has hollowed out. Middle income, middle skill jobs have gone away. They're not gone, but they're a much smaller slice of our workforce than they used to be. The manufacturing jobs, the administrative jobs, the bookkeeping jobs. And what's taking their place are lower income, more tenuous forms of work. And we talk about it as a great job shift because it's something, it is a big change in our economy, but I explicitly don't usually talk about it as the future of work, even though that's a phrase you're hearing all the time now. And the reason I don't talk about it as the future of work is that the future of work makes it sound inevitable. Like, here's this freight train, and it's coming, and we're just all it just is what it is, right? It is what it is. The reality is that those middle income, middle skilled jobs that we lionize today, particularly manufacturing, that was not initially a good job. At the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, working in a factory was a noticeably bad job, right? Dangerous, literally, right? Dangerous, incredibly long working hours, sometimes paid in company script, right? It was not a good job. But people noticed that, workers noticed, policymakers noticed, right? Government noticed, businesses noticed that they needed a workforce that was more stable in order to be more effective. And we changed enough policies around work that those jobs became really great jobs. So we're going to have to figure out how to do that for the jobs our economy is currently delivering. Service jobs, caring jobs, retail jobs. Otherwise, what you see is what Carol Shelton described, right? Is increasing volatility, an inability to plan, an inability to think about the future because you're just worried about this week's bills. The second trend we really notice as batting about these families is related. It's the idea of a great shift in risk. So there's a Yale political scientist named Jacob Hacker who first talked about this, and he described it the great risk shift. And it's easiest to explain the great risk shift by example. So the best example he gives, I think, the cleanest example is how retirement savings works today. So if you contrast a pension, right, in a pension with a 401k, contrast those two, right? In a pension, the employer takes on the risk of saving enough money for retirement. The employer takes on the risk of investing that well, and takes on the risk of the ups and downs in the market over that time. And the employer spreads that risk across the shareholders and the rest of the company and all the employees. Right? In a 401k, you shift all three of those risks to the person. Right? It's now the individual's responsibility to save enough for retirement, to invest that money well, and to retire at a good time. And so we've shifted, it's an example, we've shifted a whole variety of risks to people. And you really see it in the income volatility that we've talked about a lot at this conference and elsewhere as a key finding of the Diaries, where somebody like Carol, what's happening is that she has ups and downs in her earnings because her employer is passing along the risk of ups and downs in demand for their services right to her paycheck, right? By flexing her hours based on demand. There's a lot of good reason to do that from a productivity or profitability perspective, but we need new solutions to help then manage that risk. And I think a lot of those solutions are going to require us to move that risk off of individuals and figure out ways to spread it across a group in order to put the risk where it's best able to be managed. Because right now, it's often the opposite. And that's exacerbated by the third trend that's batting families about, which is that the cost of living has been rising while incomes have remained pretty stagnant at the bottom end in particular. So, and in particular, it's the cost of things you have to invest in to get ahead that have been rising. The cost of education, the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing. They've all gone up far faster than incomes can keep pace. And so the risks that what happens as a result is that people have far less cushion to put aside savings, right? Far less cushion between their income and their spending to build up the buffer stock that allows them to manage risk. And at the same time, they have far more volatile incomes than they've ever had in the past. And so as a result, it's much harder for people to take that leap into voluntary risk-taking. And voluntary risk-taking is what's needed for mobility. You cannot get ahead unless you're willing to risk. So I'll share one more moment about a family. Sarah Johnson has stuck with me over and over. She's appeared at this conference before. Jennifer Tesher talked about her in her remarks a few years ago. And I keep going back to her because her story is so complicated to me. So I had a chance to talk to her maybe a year or two ago as we were writing. And we had an amazing conversation. She had so much fun and good stuff to report. She had just graduated college at age 40. And she had just enrolled in a master's degree program she was going to be starting later that summer. She had started an amazing community program for kids, and it was gangbusters. It was just going so well that she had been elected to the local school board. Her oldest son had just graduated, was doing great in college, and he had just made a decision she thought was really wise, which was to move home so that he didn't have to accrue as much student debt. So she just had like lots and lots of positive things to share, and very cheerful. And near the end of our conversation, she said, oh yeah, and I declared bankruptcy, right? And for me, like given where I work, I was like, how did we get all the way through this conversation before this came up, right? To me, like that would maybe be the headline. And when I said something like that, like, and for her the bankruptcy was because they had medical bills that they couldn't pay. And when I said that, she said, something to the effect of, it's not my life, right? She essentially said, I could organize my whole life around my financials, but like all this stuff my life is so good. And that to me is fundamental, right? So one last moment, really. I was giving our book talk, Jonathan and I gave a talk at NYU in the spring, not that long ago, and during the Q&A, somebody raised his hand. An older guy, I can't do a New York accent, so just like insert one here in your own mind. He said, he looked at me and Jonathan, and he said, you guys are clearly doing pretty well. You're fine. You did all this work about people who aren't fine. Why do you care? And it was in that very New York, like, why do you care? And in the moment, I was sort of taken aback, right? But it's the right question. Why do you care? Well, I care because of what Sarah Johnson said, right? If we can, like, how can we get her the life she wants, right? How can we make the financial part recede into the background in a way that she can then take the risks that she wants to take, which she's doing, without having those force her into bankruptcy? How can we give her that base of stability from which she can like launch into the life that she's building? I care about this work, I think probably for the reason that all of you care about this work, because we, through the work that we're doing here at Emerge, or back in your offices at home, or right, every day, the work that we're doing is to try and give Carol and Jim Shelton their Sunday nights back, right? It's to try and diminish Mareed's loneliness, give him that sense of security and connection that he's missing. It's to make sure that Melinda, all that hard work that she's doing, gets leveraged into the best possible outcome for her. And fundamentally, it's about being able to be like Maria and to be able to turn red flags into possibilities. Thank you very much.